On a mission, on a quest, on a search for discovering the truth. Join us on our journey to discovering a Savior.
All right, welcome to Your Church Friends. I'm Chris.
I'm Yurdlich.
Jumping a little bit backwards, looking at the guy with leprosy, because you talked about it, like he approached Jesus. Like that was illegal.
Right.
You know, when you look at the laws of everything, that was the one thing. Because what stood out was the covered in leprosy. That's what I looked into. Some translations are full of leprosy. That's why I knew this was the Hansen disease and maybe not the eczema one, where like this is the big thing. This is an advanced case. You know, Luke being a doctor, saying full of, this is an advanced case. But him approaching Jesus is illegal. In Numbers, it said, the Lord said to Moses, command the Israelites to send away from the camp anyone who has a defiling skin disease or discharge of any kind, or who is ceremonially unclean because of a dead body. Send away male and female alike and send them outside the camp, so they will not defile the camp where I am dwelling. So the Israelites did so, and they sent them outside the camp, just as the Lord instructed Moses. So this became a law. Like this was a thing that, like, if you're unclean, you're outside the camp. You're not allowed in the city. You're not allowed in normal Israeli society. That was illegal. But then when you look at this guy, and we're talking about what leprosy was, like, yeah, what did he have to lose? So this is illegal that I'm in the city and I'm going to Jesus.
What are you going to do, kill me?
Right. I'm
Which,
already
going back to if he's going through the same mental stuff that we know from modern stuff, it'd be like, yeah, what does he have to lose?
Yeah, what are you going to do? You're going to kill me? So, like, you know, again, he goes to the Lord, if you're willing to make me clean. And again, yeah, you're talking about like restoration. You're talking about restoring this person, like healing what he has. But there was no previous example of Jesus doing that up to this point. You know, we're looking at like Jesus healing a leper. It was people with diseases. But did it say leper in some of the previous stuff? Or
no, I was going to say Elijah healed a leper, right?
Yeah, so that's I was going there.
There is precedent for prophets healing lepers.
Healing lepers, but like Jesus doing this, there was none of that. Him coming to him was such a step of bold, like, faith.
Which is one, but based off of the precedent of like, well, the prophet way back when had did it. Here's a prophet coming through, like maybe this guy can do it too.
Right.
Like I can see how precedent would help in that.
Yeah.
I mean, we see other people in Jesus' life that come forward and ask him to do stuff that they probably never heard of. But
yeah. So the crazy thing was there's only 2 people in the Bible with leprosy getting healed. And it's the Elijah one, Naaman. And then Miriam.
Name him.
And then Miriam, who God struck with leprosy because she was speaking out against Moses.
Sorry, his name is Naaman.
Yes.
I was making a joke.
Okay.
Name him? Yeah, Naaman.
Yeah. No, I
Miriam,
got the joke. I was
Miriam.
going with you.
Okay. Just the way that you said it, I was like, oh, it sounded like you thought that's what I was
I was going with you.
Okay.
So Miriam got it. God struck her as a punishment because she was like talking about Moses. And then Moses prayed for her healing. And then 7 days of isolation, she was back in. And then the other one was like 7 times in the Jordan, right? Like dipping the Jordan 7 times. So the great lawgiver and the great prophet, you know, there is precedent to it. For him to come to Jesus, he had to think like, this guy is better than, at least on par with the lawgiver and the prophet, if not more capable to do it. Again, you know, in this situation, what does he have to lose? Like it's a huge thing. The other thing I want to touch on was the touch aspect of it, because we saw in the other things, it was just the word, the demons, just by his word gone, sickness gone, just by speaking. But this one was touch, and I like what N.T. Wright put out here, because to me, it's just like it seemed more like out of compassion, you know, because if you're a leper, what have you not had in a long time? And if you're having an advanced case, you haven't, you know, no one's touched you. But N.T. Wright put, nobody had touched this man. We may suppose for years his body was now riddled with the disease. It had clearly been quite literally eating away at him for a long time, and now Jesus reaches out and touched him. We can only imagine the sense of awe and joy that brought to the man. Just like that alone, that, you know, the touch happened and then the healing happened. And I thought that was pretty cool. Even looking at like how Pharisees, again, going back to how they would treat people, anyone with skin diseases, they were like, they're sinners, right? Because that's what their thought is. You've got this. You're a sinner. You're an outcast. I mean, the way they treated even Samaritans and tax collectors were pretty, not great. It was very elitist type stuff. But to touch a leper, and then I heard this, and it just like sparked some other things in my head as looking at this. But like the Samaritan, the Good Samaritan story, where the Levi and the rabbi,
they wouldn't touch him because they thought he was dead,
and it would make them unclean.
Yeah.
But the Samaritan was willing to take that risk, and I was like, man, that's a huge. Why is no one teaching that? That's a huge part of like that story.
No, yeah, that's like the main reason why they were just like, oh yeah, I got to keep to my thing, which is even weirder because it's not like if you touch a corpse, you're disqualified. It's just like, well, you got to spend like 7 days and you got to go through this ritual. So it's even like, I don't know, as I've heard it taught in different ways, and again, you kind of read into a bit, but it's just like, if I go deal with this, it's going to be annoying. It's almost like when you hear from like, I don't want to deal with the paperwork.
Yes. Yeah. That's really what it comes down to. So, the fact that Jesus touched him, he's reached out and touched someone who was unlovable and untouchable. And then I was wanting to get to that too. He touched him and Jesus didn't become unclean. It reversed. It was the reverse Uno card. Yeah. It's like, boom, here it is. Now you're clean. And he touches him and he becomes clean, and it just, all of it works differently. And I think that's where, for me, you start seeing the bigger picture of kind of this conversation. What's the difference between unclean and what's the difference between sin, right? Because once Jesus touches us, that we're clean. Once he comes into our lives, we're clean of that state. And then, because of our flesh, there's still those struggles in there, but we're clean. We can go before him. We're allowed to go into his presence. There isn't that like 7-day outside the camp thing. Forgiveness is there. Forgiveness is quicker. And, you kind of see that picture here getting presented with Jesus being able not just to, because that's the big thing. The guy now, he has to go do the Levitical thing, right? Go present yourself to the priest. So the priest has to look him over, make sure he's clean, make sure there's no more disease on him. And then the guy now gets to go back to his family, gets to go back to his village, gets to go back to his community. He's a fully accepted member now, as if he had no leprosy. And now he's back part of that. So now not only is this guy, in the eyes of the Pharisees, morally clean, but now he's ceremonially clean. Yeah. And he's back in the community. And Jesus does that for us.
So I'm going to jump back a bit and then try and run up to catch up with you in the conversation. Is when you're saying on the touching side of things, I went back. I think we touched on an earlier conversation. I think it was like when Simon's mother-in-law and kind of were talking about that. And then there's the demons, which may have been part of the next episode, maybe part of that episode. But it says that Jesus laid his hands and healed people. So he was laying his hands as part of the healing. Just, I don't think it's part of the demon stuff. I don't think that that's part of like exorcism practice. Could be wrong. There might be other sections that has it. But as far as the touching, there was already him touching and healing people and doing that. But even with that, I'm not saying that to take away from the part that you and Mr. Tom Wright came up with as far as, dude hasn't had a hug in a while.
Yeah.
Like,
that means a lot, dude.
It does. I think that I've read it, even like, I would be making up statistics, but feel free for anybody to look up like how long your average American male goes without touch. It's pretty crazy that like men don't get affectionate touch.
Yeah.
And just like all the psychological studies that have been done on that, and just like men who are part of society look at what happens from not getting touch. This sounds like far outside of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, just there's that. But looking at the thing of uncleanness, I know that we've really talked on it on unclean doesn't equal sinfulness. There is some sin that could equal uncleanness, sexual immorality and idolatry, to mainly highlight those two. But so Leviticus is just like, hey, no, this is just like ritually, ceremonially unclean. When you get into like the prophets, Isaiah and otherwise, they are very heavily drawing on the correlation and using those examples that like, hey, your sin is making you unclean.
Right, yeah.
Like the language does start to get used.
Yeah.
Which I think just part of our conversation to touch on that of just like scripture itself draws those connections of just like, yeah, you know what that is. And sin is doing that within you as an individual and within you as a people. But then you brought it to the point, and why that was on my mind and why I want to touch on it is because you were talking about Jesus and what his restoration does.
Mm-hmm.
And to link back to why I was saying earlier with Leviticus of like, you have 11 through 15 just kind of put in here about what being clean is. And then you get 16 is talking about the Day of Atonement.
Right.
And the big thing that we look at as far as Jesus being a Messiah is like we look at him offering atonement.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look at atonement really being on like this purifying side of things, a lot of times I think that as modern Christians, we think like, oh yeah, forgiveness of sins. But atonement for the camp, atonement for Israel, it was really part of this thing of like, on this day, we're going to confess all the sins, but what's going to happen is this power of chaos and darkness and death that through all of our actions has been like encroaching on the camp. This Day of Atonement is going to be like a force of life pushing it all out and cleansing everything again. That like where we are is like God's land, it's holy land, and it's clean and it's pure from all these things. And so when we see Jesus coming through and he's healing leprosy and he's healing the woman with the issue of blood and he's like raising the dead back to life, all of these things that are like ritually unclean, but he's also going and forgiving sin. Like I think that the bigger picture there, because as we're saying, if you're ceremonially unclean, you can't come into God's presence. Has nothing to do with, well, you're a sinful person, you can't come into God's presence. Like there's a thing of like uncleanness. And when Jesus is offering purity and cleanness in that sense, but also forgiveness, like what's the end result of that? Like you can come into God's presence. And it's not a thing that, I know I'm jumping ahead or backwards, I don't even know how or if we'd cover it, but it's like really the end goal, what Jesus is coming to do isn't to allow us to go to the temple that's in Jerusalem. It's that we are the temple and God's Spirit comes into us.
Right.
So that's where being made clean really matters. Because if you're looking at like, oh, I had a nocturnal emission, I can't go to the temple for like 7 days or whatever it is. Like I can't go into God's presence and I'm cut off from all of that. To the Spirit of God is living inside of you.
Right.
Like what Jesus is bringing, it's just so far beyond anything that's even like of what could possibly be on the radar of like the conversations of just like, well, yeah, what's the proper thing for leprosy?
Right.
Like, you know what I mean? Why I'm bringing that in is like, we're tracking with Jesus on a journey, and I'm kind of looking towards, because I kind of already know some of the destination that we're heading towards, and just
you
like,
read ahead?
Yeah, been hearing about it for a long time. Spoiler alerts. It's like we're watching The Chosen. It's just like, is it called a spoiler if kind of been written down for 2,000 years? You know,
what a horrible show. You create a show and your main character dies at the end.
Gave it away.
Yeah.
but in that, like, that's where I'm looking at these things and like, cool. So we're on this journey. We're discovering a savior, and it's like, okay, he's dealing with leprosy. He's dealing with uncleanness. He's dealing with sinfulness. But looking towards like, is that all? Like, you know, like, oh, cool. Right. Not that, oh, that's all. Like this guy with leprosy got to go to his family and everything that you just said is like, that's a completely changed life. But Jesus offers even so much more than that. Yeah. Which I think is amazing.
The term restoration really does encompass more than just what this restoration presents, right?
There's a huge image of it.
And it was making me think too, again, maybe skipping ahead, maybe not, but like, there are moments when Jesus heals someone and then tells them, go and sin no more. You don't see this here. You don't see that. What you see is go present. Don't tell anyone, right? Because being known that you're the Messiah is going to get you killed. So that time has not yet come. So it's don't tell anyone. But it's then go present yourself to the priest, make the sacrifice. When the time comes that you need to make the sacrifice to the temple, that's when you go and you make the sacrifice to the temple. If, whatever wealth you have, whether it's the 2 doves or the bigger thing, but you go make the sacrifices that are required, present yourself to the priest, and then that's it. But it isn't followed with and go and sin no more. So this is a good comparison to like, well, what was different between him and the other people? Because clearly if he's telling someone go and sin no more, there must have been something inside that was wrong, like the sinfully wise, morally. But yeah, there's a huge difference. But either way, what does he do? He restores it all. The work on the cross did do that. It was a restoration, not just to make us ceremonially clean, but also now we can be morally clean as well.
And that's having part of this conversation and camping out a little bit in Leviticus or even touching on, like, I just don't think that for modern people who are largely been in a Christian world where so much of this has been like taken care of for 2,000 years, that like we even care or appreciate being made clean. Like, you know what I mean? It's just like, Leviticus, that's boring. Yeah. Why would I ever read that? It doesn't make sense. Also, it doesn't really apply, right? Also, and it's just like to not realize that big part of Jesus's life and ministry and death and resurrection, what has been accomplished. Like, it's just like, I don't know, unappreciative of it because you don't even know what it is.
Yeah, a lot of times when you look at the Old Testament in large, there's like, I think sections that are people are more happy with. You got your Psalms. People love Psalms and Proverbs and stuff like that.
Sorry, just people love Psalms. It's just like, have you read them all? God, kill them.
Yeah.
Kill them big, kill them hard.
Knock out their teeth. Yeah. But Genesis and half of Exodus gets its fame. But everything else after that and in between, like no one wants to read. No one wants to read about the Israelites having to wipe out a nation. No one wants, or groups of people. No one wants to read Numbers because it's just list of people and stuff like that. Deuteronomy is a repetitive thing of what you've already read. Chronicles are going to put you to sleep for the most part. And I'm saying a lot of this, like sarcastically. Leviticus is like, that's just the rules one. That's the one that tells me I can't have 2 different fabrics on touching each other and stitched in. That's the one where, wait, do we follow this now? Do we make sacrifices? Do we not make sacrifices? Why don't we make sacrifices anymore?
Can I eat ribs?
Can I? Yes, pork ribs. Can I?
The good ribs.
Yeah.
The other ones don't count as ribs.
The McRib. Can I have the McRib when it's seasonal and out? That's what it gets looked at. That's what it's viewed as. But you are missing when you don't read Leviticus a good chunk of understanding.
Sorry, a couple off-topic things, and I'll bring it back in. But the kids' summer thing was today, and they had the leaders go up, and they were doing like sword drills. So it's like, cool, we're going to tell you a Bible verse. You need to like put your Bible on your head, pull it down, whoever finds it first, right? And they're doing like a knockout challenge. And one of the verses was in Amos. And I heard someone next to me like, Amos, like, where is that at? And I was like, yeah, we have an episode on that. If you want to go listen to our Forgotten Books of the Bible series, like there's Amos. There's a few episodes on that.
He does more than just cookies.
And then one of them was Philemon.
Oh,
and then someone was like, how did you pronounce that? Like, what is that? And I was like, we have an episode on that. You can just when you're talking about all these things, they're like, oh yeah, the Old Testament, outside of like the popular stuff, it tends not to get read.
I mean, that's the Bible in general, right? Like outside of the popular stuff, Philemon. I mean, most people would just understand it as Philemon.
Yeah. It's a weird Pokemon.
Yeah. Got to catch them all.
But yeah, in tracking and all right, so Leviticus as a rule book. I think that's an important thing to bring to Jesus as well. Is that Jesus, yes, he's touching someone with leprosy, which unclean, right? But he does it because look at what the result, like, I don't know. Did he touch a person with leprosy? Because it seems like that person doesn't have leprosy. Like, it's kind of the thing of just like, well, what's, where's the fault there? But then also the mercy, how you said, like, it's illegal. That person shouldn't have come up. But we see time and time again that Jesus is just like, no, like, mercy is important in the law. And that's what he comes against the Pharisees. Like, you guys are all concerned about tithes. You're forgetting about mercy and righteousness. Like, you're not getting the important things important. So even there of seeing, like, it's not that he's ignoring the law. He's very much keeping it, even when it comes to, cool, you've been healed, go, do the proper thing.
Right.
Go to the priest, do the proper sacrifice, and do it. Like, Jesus very much keeps to all of this Old Testament stuff. Like, for Jesus, Leviticus is super important, which is a thing that I get into conversations a lot with people who, like, disagree with a lot of the Old Testament, but they love Jesus. I'm like, Jesus had every opportunity to point out anything wrong with the Old Testament. You know, if it got, like, distorted or there was something going on or any of that stuff going on, like, Jesus had every opportunity to point that out. He didn't attack the Old Testament in the way that modern scholars want to attack the Old Testament. He's attacking how are they applying it.
Right.
Even was like, hey, what they're saying to do is good, but just don't live it how they're living it. But, like, the words are legit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, like the tithing and all the stuff and the extra minute, like none of that was wrong, but it was like what was inside, like the heart of it all. That's what made them unclean. Yeah. I really do think it's a big chunk of understanding even this, like this story in the Bible, this moment that Luke hits of knowing the Levitical laws, because it doesn't pop out of all the things that are happening, right? Covered in leprosy. This guy is like advanced state, uncurable, even in today's probably society where we at least could stop some of it, right? He's just walking dead. Breaks the law because he comes to Jesus, and then Jesus touches him, and now he's clean. Like all this, what's clean, what's unclean thing. And I really like how you put it together, like the two sons of Aaron story. Then all of a sudden, here's what makes you unclean and clean, and what allows you to come into the presence of God and what doesn't, and how you can get back into the presence of God. And then it picks up like, okay, the Day of Atonement. And a lot of things, like I don't think you even mentioned it, but when the Day of Atonement is, the priest put his hand on the sheep, right? That went out, the sheep that carries the sins, went out to Azazel.
The goat, right?
The goat. Yeah, he touches him and it goes out.
It's a goat or a sheep? It's a goat, right?
It's one or the other, but he puts his hand on it.
Must be a goat. Those things look...
I think it's a goat because they send the goat back to the goat god and a scapegoat demon thing. But
scapegoat, yeah, that's what it is.
So, but the touch, you know, to me is what's, there's this parallels of like the touch is what the sin went out, and then the other one is sacrificed. But again, understanding sacrifice, and this I just learned really myself, is like understanding sacrifice wasn't just that we killed an animal and burned it on an altar. It was that they ate and consumed it, and the idea is that they're eating and consuming it with God. So then Jesus being that, right, that new thing for us that cleanses us, that makes us clean, is when we take communion, when we do something like that, we are participating in a cleansing in a sense.
And even so much of, I know that we're going on all kinds of stuff, but Day of Atonement, right? The one that is sacrificed. It's not like, oh, killing was a punishment that needed to happen. Like the death was a means to an end for the blood. Like the blood is where the life is.
Right.
And like that's how you get the blood. Like, you know what I mean? Which is where one of the things in the Old Testament and in the New Testament is like, you don't eat or drink blood. That's a no-no. That's demonic.
Right.
There may or may not be plenty of groups within America and globally that do weird stuff with blood.
Yeah.
Still, like, big time. It's not conspiracy. It happens. Christians don't do that. Like, there is power within the blood, which comes to, like, Jesus on the cross. Why we sing all those old hymns and the new songs and everything else. It's like the blood having the importance for the cleansing. Like, we read in the book of Hebrews that he goes and he puts the blood, like, in the real temple in the holy, like, you know, in the heavenly temple. And that's what makes things clean forever, that we're not repeating all of these offerings. So, no, let's go off topic.
And that's the thing about the death of Jesus. It's the blood, right? The one goat doesn't, it's not killed. The sin goat isn't killed.
I mean, it dies.
It dies, out in the desert, in the wilderness with the sin demon, but it's not like sacrificed. So when we look at what Jesus is doing, you know, this is always hard for me because it's such a thing that our church grows up, you know, the Protestant churches, Jesus took on our sin and died for our sin, and that's atonement. But it's getting with like what the Eastern Orthodox look at it, like, no, that's not what was being presented there. Like, what they're talking about is that Jesus' blood, his cleansingness, is what washes us and makes us clean. He's not taking on our sin in a sense as much as he's this image touched us and made us clean because he's clean.
Yeah.
And it's a hard thing because I wrestle with what I've grown up knowing and hearing this new thought.
Well, it's the cross and the gospel is, I always think of it I use the word multifaceted a lot. Which multifaceted,
Yeah.
it's like you look like at a diamond. It's got all the faces. And like as you turn it, there's different faces to it, and you can see the different beauty and the gleaming and the everything through that and the clarity through it. And like scripture talks about like he was who was without sin being made sin, which I know that looking at Eastern Orthodox, they'll tend to say that Paul was using shorthand for him being made sin was shorthand for he was being made into the sin offering, rather than, you know, Protestant and otherwise like understanding of like no, he was actually taking on the sin. Because when you're looking at, well, can everything about the cross be summed up in a direct parallel to the Day of Atonement? It's like, I don't think so. Like other stuff was going, like that's an image of it, and he was making atonement, but I do think that there's other stuff within the conversation that it's hard because it's just like, well, it's this, or it's this, or it's this, or just like, well, yeah, those are all images of what's happening. That if it's kind of like anything where it's like when you try and hear people talk about the Trinity and they use like little examples of stuff, and it's like eventually all of it breaks.
The water, ice,
like. Yeah, or you know,
Steam.
it's just like eventually analogies break and images break. And when I look at like atonement, Jesus did create, like he did achieve atonement. That might not be the fully correct theological word, but you know, atonement happened through Jesus to say it. But many things happen through that.
Right.
Like Day of Atonement, I don't think achieved resurrection for anybody. Yeah, Jesus achieved resurrection through the cross. You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of other stuff.
There's a lot of layers to it.
Yeah. Onions.
To wrap all this up.
Wait, I have one more thing.
Oh, do you?
I didn't get to it, and it's going to be a side note, and then you can wrap it up in the way that it should be. Going back to some of those things of being unclean, like the food and the not touching corpses and the sexual stuff going on, is an added layer to God saying that those things were unclean and not welcome into the full presence of like the temple or, you know, the tabernacle when it was the tabernacle, is that those things couldn't get misused and appropriated towards the worship of God. What you see is in pagan cultures is that they've got like temple prostitutes and various things.
Yeah.
So there's like, no, like sex isn't part of the thing. You've got like ancestor worship and various things happening on that. It's just like, no, dead bodies, like that's not part of what's going on. And just blood, things related to blood. It's just like, nope, that's like, it was just the layers of preventative of like, this isn't how you're going to approach me. You're not going to use these things that the pagan nations are using. Like you're coming to me in the way that I'm prescribing.
Yeah, this is what separates worship to me from worship to the other gods.
Which was a huge thing in Leviticus. Like, well, what was the purpose for all this? It was just like that you would be a holy people. Holy meaning set apart, right? Like you're going to be different than all the other nations. So like, here's some stuff that like outside of everything about like, oh, well, you're not fully made whole and like blood goes out and everything. It's just like, this is going to mark you as being different.
Right.
Because guess what? This is real different. Like, and it even prevents you from like, oh, all of those pagan nations, they're going and offering sacrifices to their God. A lot of times it was going to be pig. You don't get to eat that.
Right.
Like it's a preventative measure even from you joining in with doing that. And then I love, this is just one last thing on like the I think that some of what I almost wish that there was something of this train of thought of keeping clean with some form of rule is because of this, and I found it when I was studying, is in keeping these day-to-day laws. Like, it wasn't the responsibility of the high priest. These laws that were in Leviticus were disseminated and told to the people, and it was the heads of the household, the heads of the patriarch, like whole family and everything that was like, they were keeping these things, and it was a willingness and a desire to stay clean and to keep yourself clean, but it's like in the small things of, oh, I'm not going to eat shellfish. It's every time you're coming to a meal, you're thinking about, how am I keeping myself holy before God? You know, anytime you're going through natural things in life, you're going, oh, I need to keep myself holy and clean before God. And it's in these small, seemingly mundane things that, like, yeah, every month for a woman, like, you're going to go through that process. It has nothing to do with you being sinful, but it's always on the forefront of the mind that in everyday circumstances, how am I keeping myself clean? To where, like, when you're so focused on, like, taking care of that, like, yeah, why am I going to go out there and do that crazy sin? Like, you know, just how tightly it keeps your mind locked on to, like, staying clean before God. That I appreciate that. And I know that at times that's where I've wanted there to almost be like a rule book in the New Testament. Because it's just like, just tell me what I'm supposed to do. Give me like a framework to lock into that, like, I can know that I'm really putting it into practice. So, but it is something that I think there's not a Leviticus in the New Testament, but in finding practices, to, you know, to keep yourself clean and to be seeking after Him in those ways, to put practices into your everyday life to be pursuing. I don't know. I just like that concept.
Yeah. It's crazy how, like, the law was given and how quick, like, the wheels fell off of that thing.
Oh, yeah.
How quickly they were like, here's how you keep yourself clean. And they're like, and then they did all of this stuff. And then the Old Testament is just littered with people not following through, from judges to kings to...
You know what we should do? We should sacrifice a pig in
Right.
the temple.
Right. Yeah. It's just like as quickly as they could, they did it. The wrap up I have for this is verse 16. I think I'm going to read a little bit up front of that, though. It says, yet the news about him spread all the more, so the crowds of people came to hear Jesus and to be healed of their sickness. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. And I love this. N.T. Wright put it this way. He said that this would be his source of strength. And Luke mentioning this, going off to pray in solitary places, is where Jesus would draw his strength to do what he did, to draw the strength to keep on mission. And I didn't put it down in my notes, but I just remembered from reading the commentary that he even phrased it as like, where are you drawing your strength? Because there are people in your lives that needs to be touched with the loving kindness that Jesus touched this guy. And if you're not drawing your strength from God, you're not going to meet that need to touch someone who's untouchable. And I thought that was like just a cool way he summed up his little section. I get it from what is it?
Like Luke for Everyone?
Yeah, Luke for Everyone, his Everyone series, and because he just like breaks it down with stories and everything. And I just sometimes really love the way he paints the picture of like what's happening. And that was a good one. But it just makes you think, you know, we're talking about what makes you clean, what makes you unclean, what makes you a sinner, and what makes you not. And kind of tying it all into the idea of like, hey, Jesus went out, you know, because a lot of people are like, well, if Jesus was around today, who would he hang out with? He would hang out with X, Y, and Z, whatever sin category or group of people you want to fill in there. But every time he did, it was with the goal of making them clean, presentable.
Clean and sin no more.
Clean and sin no more. Not just go and hang out with them and be buddies with them. And I feel like for us as Christians, knowing where our source is, that putting ourselves in those places to touch someone who may not be touchable in the sense, you know, in the Christian realm, that if we don't have the right source, then when we get there, we might become unclean ourselves. It might defile us with our thoughts and how we think. But the idea is that we go to spread the good news and the gospel to help other people come into this, to make them clean, and be part of it so that they can go into God's presence, not just eternally, but here on earth, where we can be in a state of like, hey, I'm in the presence of God. Like you said, those daily actions. What am I doing? Is this keeping me in God's presence? Can this keep me in the presence of God as far as like how I'm acting, living, and what I'm doing? But yeah, that was really it. I just really liked how N.T. Wright phrased that all up, that little small added to the story.
Yeah, there's a fun thing in looking at biblical stories. Because like a lot of times they're like, oh, align myself with the hero.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, Jesus went and did it. So if that's where Jesus is doing it, like, where are you doing it?
Mm-hmm.
But also sometimes like you should be doing that, especially when it comes to Jesus, because like he's modeling for us what to do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, can I do everything that Jesus did? Evidently not. Like, especially some things that only he could do, like going to the cross for us and, you know, performing the atonement. Achieving the atonement coming through him. He's the only one. I don't know about the way I'm phrasing that. I just feel like someone's gonna be like, heresy.
Well, if they made it this far, they've heard Enoch, so.
No, it's a new listener. But I think that's really one of those things of him drawing away to be with the Father. That if Jesus, I don't know if it's more appropriate to say wanted to or had to do that. Yeah, like, why do I think that I can go without doing that? Because it's either, if he was like having to do that, then don't I?
Mm-hmm.
Or if he was just wanting to, shouldn't I? Like, you know, either way that I cut that is like, I don't think that's just he was on his special mission, so he had to be with the Father in order to do that. I really think that that's a modeling thing. I'm glad that you brought it back into that, because he didn't say or do anything that he didn't get from the Father.
Right.
And honestly speaking, I say and do all kinds of stuff that I know I'm not getting from the Father because I didn't even check in with him.
Yeah.
So it's like, how am I going to say that that's what I did if, like, really? So I'm going to end it off on that form of confession.
Yeah, you know, it's just the idea of like, sometimes we're like, man, I keep struggling with this. You know, we're talking about what makes you clean, sinful, sinning, we struggle. But like, a lot of times the quickest answer is like, well, how's your prayer life? Because if you're not getting strength from the source and you're just trying to combat this on your own, you're going to struggle. It is a struggle to combat sin all on your own. If it wasn't a struggle, or if it was something we could do, we wouldn't need a savior.
Which is like, imagine there was an example of someone that could be so bold to like go, what else do I have to lose? Maybe I can go to this Jesus and say, if you're willing, would you do this? It would be crazy if there's like an example of that with us in our struggles, if we could go to this same Jesus and go, if you're willing,
make me clean.
And imagine we had an example of seeing Jesus' heart.
Yeah.
That he is willing so much of the time.
All the time, yeah. Where are we headed next?
You tell me.
What does it mean to walk in forgiveness?
Yeah, I had to ask you because I don't know.
Yeah, that's a big one. I think it's going to be fun. You know, again, we're pulling out these little things from these discovering a Savior journey through, all the passages we're looking at. But there's these big concepts sometimes in them that are, don't get really touched. And walking in forgiveness is a huge one. I think a lot of times we as Christians, we can somewhat forgive. But like in myself, how do I myself walk in the forgiveness God gave me? That's a little different. That sometimes is harder, but we'll touch on that next time. So I'm Chris.
I'm Mirza.
We are your church friends. Thanks for listening.